The stranger lay face down in the buffalo grass at the edge of the property line, and for one long moment Annie Covington was certain he was dead. She had come out at first light with her measuring chain and her late husband's compass to walk the boundary herself, before the county surveyor arrived to do it official, because she did not trust any man sent by the court to draw a line across land that had cost her everything to keep. She had not expected to find a body. "Sir," she called, though it felt foolish to call to a man who did not move. She set down the chain and hurried closer, her skirts catching on sage, and knelt beside him. Blood had dried dark along his temple, and his shirt was torn at the shoulder, and when she pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw she felt, faintly, gratefully, a pulse. That was when she heard the horse. She looked up to see a rider coming along the section line at a canter, a tall man in a gray coat with a leather satchel slung across his back, and a brass transit case lashed behind his saddle, unmistakably the surveyor the county had sent, a full day earlier than she had been told to expect him. He reined in hard when he saw her kneeling over the body and swung down before his horse had fully stopped. "Is he alive?" the man asked, already crouching on the other side of the stranger. "Barely," Annie said. "You are the surveyor." "Monroe Easton," he said, not looking up from checking the man's pulse himself, his hands quick and sure. "County Land Office sent me to resurvey the section line between your homestead and the Kettering Range. I did not expect to find a man half killed in the grass on the way." "Neither did I, and it is my land you are walking on to say so," Annie said, though there was no real heat in it, only the sharp edge of fear. "We must get him to Dr. Sutter. Willow Creek is 6 miles. My horse can carry 2 if we go slow," Monroe said. "Help me lift him." Between them they got the man draped across the saddle, and Monroe walked alongside holding him steady while Annie led her own mare with the transit case tied on behind. They had gone perhaps a quarter mile when the stranger stirred, groaned, and his eyes opened, wild and unseeing at first, then fixing on Annie's face with sudden, desperate clarity. "The ledger," he rasped. "Tell them the ledger is wrong. Kettering's men changed the brands, changed the water lines too. I wrote it all down before they found me. I hid it good, but you have to tell someone, you have to." His breath caught and his eyes rolled back and he went limp again. Annie stood frozen in the dry grass with her hand still on her mare's bridle and looked across the stranger's slumped body at Monroe Easton, whose face had gone very still. "You know that name," she said. It was not a question. "I know the Kettering Cattle Syndicate," Monroe said carefully. "Everyone in 3 counties knows it. That is all I meant." But something in the way he said it told her it was not all, and she filed that away the way she filed away every fact that might matter later, the way a woman learns to do when she has buried a husband and fought a court for her own land and cannot afford to trust easily. She said nothing more until they reached Willow Creek. Willow Creek in the summer of 1887 was a town built on the promise of grass and water, and that summer both were failing it. The creek that gave the town its name ran the color of weak tea and no higher than a man's boot, and the wheat in the fields around the courthouse stood thin and pale, and every rancher from the Arkansas Breaks to the Platte Divide watched the sky for clouds that never gathered into rain. Dry Fork County had not seen a decent storm in 11 months, and the talk on the porch of the Mercantile was all of which springs still ran and which had gone to dust, and who still had cattle worth counting after the terrible die-up winter the year before had already halved every herd in the territory. Dr. Sutter's office sat above the dry goods store on the town's single brick street, and he took the unconscious man in without question, the way he had taken in gunshot wounds and broken bones and fever cases for 30 years, without once asking a person's politics before he asked after their pulse. "He will live if the fever does not take him," Sutter said after an hour of work, wiping his hands on a rag gone pink with blood. "Someone beat him thorough. Ribs, skull, hand near crushed. He fought back some, I think, before they finished with him." "Who is he?" Monroe asked. "Ezra Prout," Sutter said. "Kept the books for the Kettering outfit these 3 years past. I have seen him about town, quiet fellow kept to himself. He looked between Annie and Monroe with the particular sharpness of a man who has learned to read trouble on people's faces. What was he doing bleeding half to death on the Covington section line? Neither of them had an answer worth giving, not yet, and so they gave none, and Sutter did not press, only told them to send word if the man woke and said anything worth remembering, and to keep it quiet who had found him until he knew more himself about who might come looking. Annie Covington had not meant to spend her morning in town. She had a shop 3 doors down, a narrow front room with a bell over the door and 2 sewing machines she had bought on credit the year after Daniel died, and a growing trade in wedding dresses and mourning blackened shirts for men who could not be bothered to learn a needle. And she was behind on an order for the banker's wife that was due by Saturday. But she found herself standing on the boardwalk outside Sutter's stairs instead, watching Monroe Easton settle his horse at the livery, and she found she was in no hurry at all to walk away. He was younger than she had first taken him for, perhaps 32 or 3, with the sun-weathered look of a man who spent his working life outdoors under a transit and tripod rather than a desk, and hands that were careful in a way she noticed because Daniel's hands had been careful too, once, before the fever took the carefulness out of him along with everything else. Monroe Easton had not asked her a single unnecessary question since they had found Ezra Pruitt in the grass, and there was something in that restraint that made her curious rather than suspicious, though she reminded herself that curiosity about a man was not the same as trust, and trust was the thing she had learned, at considerable cost, to require before she gave anyone anything at all. "You will still be surveying my boundary," she said, when he came back from the livery. It was not quite a question either. "I will," he said. "Tomorrow, if that suits you. I would like it to be exact, Mrs. Covington. Whatever else is happening in this county, that line ought to be true. And if it is not where the Kettering syndicate wishes it to be," something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it, "then it is not where they wish it to be," he said. "I did not take this post to draw lines for other men's convenience." She wanted to ask him what he meant by that, wanted to ask why a man who spoke so plainly about honesty had gone so quiet and careful the moment Ezra Pruitt spoke the Kettering name, but the bell of her own shop was ringing somewhere down the street in her mind, and there would be time, she told herself. There would be time enough for questions. She did not know yet how much time it would take, nor how much it would cost them both before she had her answers. The homestead Annie Covington had fought to keep sat on 160 acres along a spring-fed draw that ran, even in that terrible dry year, with a thin clear ribbon of water that never entirely failed. Daniel Covington had filed the claim in 1880, the year they married, and they had built the soddy together with their own hands and broken the ground together. And by the time the 5 years proving up was done, and the patent came through from the land office, Daniel had already begun to cough in a way that would not stop. He died in the spring of 1885, not gunned down in some cattle war, not thrown from a horse, but taken slow by a fever that started in his lungs and ended everywhere. And Annie had buried him on the rise above the spring where he had once said he wanted to be buried, and had gone on alone. The trouble had started a year later, when a man from the Kettering syndicate rode out with papers claiming Daniel had mortgaged the homestead against a loan for cattle stock, a loan Annie had never seen signed and never seen a dollar of, and a lien recorded at the county courthouse with Daniel's signature at the bottom that looked near enough like his hand to fool a stranger, though Annie, who had watched him sign 100 letters and receipts, thought there was something wrong in the slant of it that she could never quite prove. She had gone to the county recorder, a tired man named Whitfield, who told her the paper was properly filed and properly witnessed, and there was nothing to be done. And she had gone to a lawyer in Pueblo who told her a fight would cost more than the land was worth, and in the end she had done the only thing she knew how to do, which was to keep living on the land and keep paying down what she could, and open a shop in town to make the money the ranch could no longer be trusted to make, and to wait. With the patient stubbornness of a woman who had already survived worse, for some crack to open in the wall the syndicate had built around her claim. She did not know, walking home from Dr. Sutter's that evening with the sun going down red and dusty over the dry hills, that the crack had already opened, and that it had a name, and the name was Ezra Prout, and that it was lying in a bed above the dry goods store with a fractured skull and a secret worth more than the whole of Dry Fork County put together. Monroe Easton did not sleep well that night in the room he had taken at the Willow Creek boarding house, and it was not the strange bed that kept him awake. He had come to Colorado 2 years before from Ellsworth County, Kansas, with a surveyor's commission and a past he had told almost no one about, and the sound of Ezra Prout's voice rasping about altered brands and changed water lines had reached back into that past and pulled it forward into the lamplight like a hand closing around his throat. He had worked once for a cattle syndicate in Kansas, not unlike the Kettering outfit, a company called the Prairie Rose Land and Cattle Company, and he had been young and in debt and grateful for steady wages. And when the company's manager had asked him to move a section corner 40 rods west of where it truly stood, to shift a homesteader's spring onto company land, he had done it. He had told himself it was only a survey stake, only a matter of inches on a map that would never matter to anyone who could not read a plat. He had done it twice more before the family whose spring he had stolen lost their claim entirely and left Kansas in a wagon with 3 children and no water for the road. And he had heard, months later, that the youngest of them had died of thirst and fever somewhere on the Smoky Hill Trail before they ever reached a town with a well. He had quit that same week and ridden west, and sworn to himself that he would never again put his instruments to a lie no matter who asked it of him or how much they offered to pay. He had built a new reputation in Dry Fork County on the strength of that oath, careful survey by careful survey, and he had told no one the reason for his care, because shame, he had found, did not grow smaller for being spoken, only more visible. Now the Kettering syndicate had sent for him by name to resurvey a widow's boundary, and a man who kept their books lay half dead with a warning about altered lines, and Monroe Easton understood, lying awake in the dark, that his past had ridden west after him after all, and that it had chosen, of all the women in the territory, to sit itself down across the property line from Annie Covington. He rose before dawn and went to see if Ezra Prout had woken. Prout had woken, though only barely, and Dr. Sutter would allow Monroe 5 minutes and no more. The bookkeeper's face was swollen dark on one side, his lips cracked, and when he spoke it came slow and effortful like a man dragging words up out of deep water. "You are the surveyor," Prout said. "I saw you ride up with the widow." "Mrs. Covington and I found you together," Monroe said. "Mr. Prout, you said something about a ledger." "About altered brands." Prout's one good eye fixed on him with sudden, frightened intensity. "Kettering has been running 2 sets of books 3 years now," he whispered. "One for the bank examiners, all clean, all proper. One in his own hand in a strong box showing what he really does. He buys small brands cheap when a rancher is behind on his taxes, then has his riders run a hot iron over the old mark so it reads like his own stock always was. Steals 100 head here, 200 there, off men too proud or too scared to count close, and the section lines. He has been paying men at the land office to shave homestead boundaries a few rods at a time, enough to move a spring or a stretch of creek onto his side of the fence, never enough that any one rancher thinks it worth a lawyer's fee to fight." He drew a rattling breath. "I found the true ledger. I copied out the worst of it onto paper of my own, meant to carry it to the circuit judge in Pueblo. Jesse Coyle caught me on the road with it." "Where is it now?" Monroe asked. "The paper you copied and the true ledger." But Prout's eye had already slid shut, his strength spent, and Sutter was at the door saying that was enough for one morning, and Monroe walked out into the white morning light of Willow Creek with the weight of the whole conspiracy settling onto his shoulders like a yoke he had thought he left behind him in Kansas. He found Annie Covington at her shop, a needle in her hand and a length of gray wool draped across her lap, and he told her everything Pruitt had said, though not yet everything about himself. 2 sets of books, Annie repeated slowly, setting down her needle. That would explain a great deal, Mr. Easton. My husband's lien. I never believed his signature on that paper, not truly, though I could never say how it was done. If Whitfield at the recorder's office is taking Kettering's money to file false papers, Monroe said, a forged signature on a mortgage lien would not be much trouble for him at all. Annie looked at him a long moment, her dark eyes steady in a way that made him feel, not for the first time since the day before, that she was measuring him with an instrument a good deal more precise than his own transit. "You knew something yesterday," she said. "When Pruitt spoke Kettering's name, you knew something you did not say." He could have lied. It would have been easy. She had no proof of anything, only a feeling, and feelings did not stand up in a courtroom. But he found, looking at her, that he did not want to be a man who lied to her, not even by the small omissions that felt so reasonable in the moment and grew so heavy afterward. "I worked for a cattle syndicate in Kansas once," he said. "Before I came to Colorado, I did things for them I am not proud of. Moved survey lines where they told me to move them for money, and told myself it did no real harm." He made himself hold her gaze, though it cost him something to do it. "It did real harm, Mrs. Covington. A family lost their homestead because of a line I moved 40 rods for a man's convenience, and a child died on the road afterward for want of water I had helped to steal from them. I have not put my instruments to a lie since, and I do not intend to start again in this county. But I will not stand here and let you think I came to you with clean hands, because I did not." The shop was very quiet. Outside, a wagon rattled past on the dry street, and somewhere down the block someone's dog was barking at nothing. "Thank you," Annie said finally, "for telling me plainly instead of waiting for me to find it out and wonder what else you had not said. Does it change your mind about the survey?" "It changes nothing about the survey," she said, "except that I believe now you will draw it true, because you know exactly what it costs a family when a man draws it false." She picked her needle back up, though her hands were not quite steady. "But I will tell you this, Mr. Easton. I buried a husband I trusted with my whole heart, and I have spent 2 years since fighting a syndicate that forges papers and steals water from women who cannot afford a lawyer, and I do not give my trust again easily nor all at once. You have told me the truth today. See that you keep telling it every day after, and we shall see where that leaves us." "That is a fair bargain," Monroe said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant to keep it with something very near to relief, as though he had been carrying the Kansas story alone for 2 years and had at last set part of its weight down. It was Annie who noticed, 3 days later, that they were being watched. She had ridden out to meet Monroe at the section corner where Daniel's original survey stake still stood, a weathered post half fallen sideways in the buffalo grass, so that Monroe could set his transit and check the bearing against the old plat filed at the land office. It was slow, careful work, and she found herself watching his hands on the instrument rather than the horizon he was sighting, the same careful hands she had noticed that first morning, and she was annoyed at herself for noticing, and annoyed further that the noticing did not stop simply because she willed it to. "There," Monroe said, straightening from the eyepiece. "Your true corner sits 11 rods east of where the syndicate's man marked it 2 years back, 11 rods east and downhill, which puts the whole of your spring back on your side of the line where it always belonged." 11 rods, Annie said. "That is not an accident, is it?" "No," Monroe said. "That is a man being paid to be careless in one direction only." It was then that Annie saw the rider on the ridge above them, sitting his horse very still against the white sky, watching. She had seen him about town before, a broad-shouldered man with a black hat and a way of standing that suggested he expected other men to move aside for him, and she knew his name because everyone in Willow Creek knew his name. "Jesse Coyle," she said quietly. "Kettering's foreman." Monroe followed her gaze and his jaw tightened, though he did not reach for the pistol he wore, only closed the legs of his transit with slow, deliberate calm, the way a man moves when he does not wish to look like he is afraid. "He has been watching Sutter's office too," Monroe said. "I saw him there yesterday evening, standing across the street a long while, looking up at the window where Prout is laid up." "You think he means to finish what he started?" "I think a man who beats another man half to death over a ledger does not lose much sleep worrying whether he finished the job proper," Monroe said. "We should move Prout somewhere Coyle cannot easily find him." They rode into town together that evening, faster than either of them would admit was born of fear rather than urgency, and found Dr. Sutter locking his office for the night. "He is stronger today," Sutter said, when they explained their worry. "Strong enough to move, if we are careful, though I would not call it wise under ordinary circumstances." "These are not ordinary circumstances," Monroe said. They settled at last on the home of Reverend Cyrus Whitlock, whose small frame parsonage sat behind the church at the edge of town, a place no one would think to look for a syndicate bookkeeper, and a man besides who Annie knew to be entirely unafraid of Silas Kettering, having once refused, from his own pulpit, to bless a cattle drive that everyone in the county knew had crossed 3 homesteaders' unfenced grain fields without so much as an offer of payment for the ruined crop. They moved Ezra Prout after dark, wrapped in blankets in the bed of Sutter's spring wagon, Monroe driving slow over the ruts while Annie sat in back with Prout's head cradled against her knee to keep it from jarring, and they saw no rider on the road, though Annie could not shake the feeling, the whole silent way, of eyes somewhere in the dark hills watching them pass. Reverend Whitlock took Prout in without a single question beyond whether the man needed broth or whiskey, and by midnight the bookkeeper was settled in a narrow back room with a shotgun leaning within the Reverend's easy reach beside his own bed, and Annie and Monroe stood together on the dark church steps a moment before parting for the night. "You did not have to help carry a stranger's trouble tonight," Monroe said. "It was not your fight to begin with." "It became my fight the moment my husband's forged signature ended up on a lien at the county courthouse," Annie said. "It has been my fight for 2 years, Mr. Easton. I am only glad, for once, not to be fighting it entirely alone." He looked at her in the thin starlight, and something passed between them that neither one named aloud, though Annie felt it settle into her chest like a warm stone, and she rode home to her soddy that night thinking less about ledgers and lien papers than she had any right to, and more about the steadiness of a man's hands on a transit, and the plain, unflinching way he had told her his worst truth without once asking her forgiveness for it, only her judgment. The trouble Monroe had feared came not as violence but as talk, which in a small county-seat town could cut a man down just as thorough as any bullet. It began at the Mercantile, where a clerk named Purdy who owed his position to Kettering's bank swore he had heard, from a reliable source, that the county's new surveyor had once worked for a Kansas cattle syndicate moving boundary lines for pay, and had likely been sent to Dry Fork County by that same class of men to do the very same work under a different name. It grew at the church social, where someone recalled that Monroe Easton had been the one to find Ezra Prout half dead in the grass, and asked, in the particular tone of a question meant to plant doubt rather than seek an answer, whether it was not curious that the surveyor happened to be riding that exact stretch of road at that exact hour. By the end of the week it had reached the courthouse steps, where Sheriff Dobbs, a decent but cautious man up for re-election in the fall and unwilling to make an enemy of the county's largest taxpayer, told Monroe with evident discomfort that certain citizens had raised concerns, and that it might be best, until matters were clearer, if the surveyor's commission on the Covington boundary were set aside pending review. "Concerns raised by whom, Sheriff?" Monroe asked, standing very still on the courthouse steps with his hat in his hand. "I am not at liberty to say," Dobbs said, not meeting his eyes. "I am sure it will all sort itself out, Mr. Easton. I have no particular quarrel with you myself, but a man in my position cannot be seen taking sides before the facts are settled. The facts, Sheriff, are that a man was beaten half to death for trying to expose fraud in Kettering's books, and instead of investigating that, the county is investigating me." Dobbs had no answer for that beyond an unhappy shrug, and Monroe walked away from the courthouse with the particular hollow feeling of a man who has done nothing wrong and finds himself, for the first time in 2 years, treated exactly as though he had. Annie heard the talk, too, in her own shop, from customers who lowered their voices as though she might not already know precisely what was being said. Mrs. Purdy, come to collect a mended shirt for her husband, said, not quite looking Annie in the eye, that she hoped Mrs. Covington was being careful about the company she kept these days, what with the Surveyor's history being what it was. "His history is that he told the truth about a mistake he made years ago in another territory," Annie said, snipping a thread with more force than the task required, "which is a good deal more than most men in this county have done about the mistakes they are making right now." Mrs. Purdy left with her shirt and without further comment, and Annie sat alone in her shop afterward with her hands still and her needle forgotten, thinking of the steadiness in Monroe's voice when he had confessed the Kansas story to her, unasked, and thinking that a syndicate frightened enough to spend its money turning a whole town against one honest surveyor was a syndicate that believed correctly that the truth was closing in on it. She found Monroe that evening at the livery, saddling his horse in the failing light with the particular grim economy of a man trying not to feel what he plainly felt. "They have suspended your commission," she said. It was not a question. She had heard it from 3 separate sources by the time the sun went down. "Word travels fast in Willow Creek," Monroe said, not turning around. "It travels exactly as fast as Kettering pays it to travel," Annie said. "Monroe," it was the first time she had used his given name, and he did turn at that, something unguarded moving across his face before he caught it back. "I do not believe a word of what is being said about you. I want you to know that plainly, the way you were plain with me. You are one voice in a town of several hundred, Mrs. Covington. I am aware of the arithmetic," she said, allowing herself the ghost of a smile despite everything. "But I have found in 2 years of fighting this syndicate that arithmetic is not the whole of the matter. A single true voice, spoken loud enough and often enough, can still turn a crowd if the crowd is only frightened rather than truly convinced. This town is frightened of Kettering's money, not convinced of your guilt. Those are different things, and different things can be undone. How do you propose we undo it?" "We do not talk our way out of it," Annie said. "We act our way out of it. Words got you into this trouble. Only deeds will get you free of it again." She did not know, saying it, how soon her own words would be tested, nor how thoroughly, nor that the deed which would begin to turn the town would come not from careful investigation but from fire. The drought broke the range before it broke the sky, and it was the range, dry as tinder after 11 rainless months, that caught first. It began, as such things often did that terrible summer, from nothing more than a careless spark, a cookfare left unwatched on the Kettering range itself, some said, though no one could ever prove whose fire it had truly been, and within an hour a wind out of the southwest had carried it across 3 miles of dead grass and driven it straight toward the scattered homesteads along the section lines north of Willow Creek, Annie Covington soddy and spring among them. She smelled the smoke before she saw the flame, a bitter gray smudge rising along the whole southern horizon, and she was already running for her horse when Monroe Easton came pounding up the lane on his own mount, his face streaked with soot from riding through the edge of the smoke to reach her. "The fire has jumped the bellwether fence line," he shouted, swinging down without fully stopping. "It is moving toward your spring and the whole draw beyond it. Old Tom Bellwether is trying to plow a fire break alone, and he cannot do it fast enough." "Then we will do it faster together," Annie said, and there was no fear in her voice at all, only the flat, working calm of a woman who had faced worse than fire and meant to face this too. They rode for Bellwether's place with every neighbor they could raise along the way. 6 men and 2 women by the time they reached the smoke. Plows and wet sacks and shovels gathered in a ragged, desperate line ahead of the flame front. And Monroe Easton, who had spent 2 years in this county drawing careful lines on paper, found himself instead drawing a line in the dirt with a borrowed plow, cutting a raw brown furrow across the grass to starve the fire of fuel before it could reach the Covington spring and the little cluster of homesteads beyond it. Annie worked beside him with a wet sack beating out the low flames that leapt the furrow, her face black with ash, her eyes streaming, and when a gust of wind drove a wall of flame suddenly toward old Tom Bellwether, who had stumbled and gone down hard on his bad hip. It was Monroe who ran into the smoke without a moment's hesitation and dragged the old rancher clear by main strength, his own coat catching a lick of fire along one sleeve that Annie beat out with her bare hands before it could reach his skin. "You are a fool," she told him afterward, breathless, gripping his singed sleeve in both hands as though she might shake sense into him even now, running into fire for a man twice your age. "He would have done the same for me," Monroe said, equally breathless, and there was something in the way he looked at her then, ash-streaked and furious and unmistakably frightened for him, that made the whole burning world narrow down to the small space between their 2 faces, and for one suspended second neither of them moved at all. Then the wind shifted again, and the moment broke, and they turned back to the fire together because there was still a line to hold and a spring to save and neighbors depending on both their hands. They held the line until well past midnight, until the wind finally died and the fire, starved of fresh grass, burned itself down to smoking black stubble a quarter mile short of the Covington spring, and every soul who had fought beside them that night, old Tom Bellwether most of all, had seen with their own eyes a surveyor everyone in Willow Creek had been told to distrust run straight into flame to save an old man's life, without a single thought for his own. "I do not care what they are saying about you in town," old Tom told Monroe hoarsely, gripping his soot-blackened hand in both of his own. "A man who pulls me clear of a grass fire has done more to prove himself to me than any 10 lawyers arguing his character in a courtroom. You come by my place any Sunday you like, Mr. Easton, and eat at my table, and I will tell any man in this county who says different exactly what I saw tonight." Word of the fire, and of what Monroe had done in it, spread through Willow Creek almost as fast as the rumors had, faster perhaps, because it came not from a paid clerk whispering in the mercantile but from old Tom Bellwether himself, standing on the boardwalk in his soot-stained shirt, telling anyone who would listen that the Surveyor Kettering's men wanted run out of the county had saved his life without being asked, and Sheriff Dobbs, hearing it third-hand by breakfast, found himself considerably less certain of the concerns he had been asked to raise. It was not enough, not yet, to clear Monroe's name entirely, and both he and Annie knew it. Talk could be turned back by a single night's courage, but a syndicate's forged papers, still sitting quiet and unchallenged in the county recorder's files, could only be undone by proof, and proof meant finding whatever Ezra Prout had hidden before Jesse Coyle caught up to him on the road. Prout, recovering slowly under Reverend Whitlock's care, was strong enough by the week following the fire to speak in full, careful sentences, though the left side of his face would never again move quite the way it once had. "I hid the true ledger and my own copied pages together," he told them, sitting up against a stack of pillows with Annie on one side of the bed and Monroe on the other, in the hollow of the old cottonwood down by the ford where the Willow Creek Road crosses the Dry Branch. Wrapped in oilcloth inside a tin box I once kept my lunch pail in. I meant to ride straight through to Pueblo with it, but Coyle and another man caught me not 2 miles past the ford, and I never got the chance to go back for it. And by the mercy of God, they never thought to ask me where I had already hidden it before they caught me, only where I meant to carry it. That ford sits within a half mile of the Kettering home ranch," Monroe said slowly, Coyle will have men riding that stretch of road regular. Then we go by night, Annie said, and we go quiet. Monroe looked at her sharply. You do not need to be the one who rides into danger for this, Annie. It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal Mrs. Covington wrapped around it, and she noted it and found she did not mind it at all. I have as much claim on that ledger's truth as any soul in this county, she said. Seeing as it holds, I would wager, the very papers that will prove my husband never signed away our homestead to that syndicate. I'm not asking your permission, Monroe. I am telling you I am coming, and you may either help me plan it wisely or waste your breath trying to talk me out of it. He studied her a long moment in the lamplight of the Reverend's back room, and something that might have been pride, and might have been simple relief at not having to argue a point he already knew he would lose, settled into the set of his shoulders. Then we plan it wisely, he said. They rode out 3 nights later under a moon thin as a paring, taking the long way around by the bellwether section to avoid the main road, and left their horses hobbled a 1/4 mile short of the ford in a stand of dead cottonwoods where the sound of their breathing would not carry. Annie carried a shuttered lantern and a spade. Monroe carried his revolver, loaded and holstered, but he had promised her twice already, only to be used if there was truly no other way. The old hollow cottonwood stood exactly where Prude had described it, a great split trunk gone half to rot, and it took only a few minutes of careful searching by touch before Annie's fingers closed on the cold edge of a tin box wedged deep in the hollow, wrapped, just as promised, in oiled cloth gone stiff and dry with age. It was in that same moment, box in hand, that they heard the low nicker of a horse not their own, somewhere close along the dark road, and saw the small orange flare of a struck match. Down, Monroe breathed, and they crouched together behind the cottonwood split trunk, Annie clutching the tin box hard against her chest, her heart slamming so loud in her own ears she was certain it must carry across the whole dry creek bottom. 2 riders passed at a slow walk not 40 feet from where they crouched, one of them unmistakably Jesse Coyle by his voice, complaining to his companion about a long night's ride for nothing, that the boss was growing jumpy over an old man's ravings and a widow's stubbornness, and that he for one thought Kettering ought to simply buy the Covington place outright at the tax auction and be done with the whole business. The tax auction, the other rider said. That is set for when now? Saturday fortnight, Coyle said. On the courthouse steps, same as always. Whitfield has already got the notice drawn up saying the widow is behind on her assessment on account of that lien of Kettering's, and the judge coming down from Pueblo for it don't know Whitfield's ledgers from Scripture, so it will go through clean as you please. The riders passed on into the dark, and Annie and Monroe waited a long, silent while before either of them dared to breathe easy again, and when at last they crept back to their horses and rode for home with the tin box wrapped safe in Annie's saddlebag, neither of them spoke of what they had just overheard until they were well clear of Kettering land. Saturday fortnight, Annie said finally, into the dark. They mean to auction my homestead out from under me in front of the whole county, using a lien built on a forged signature and a false tax assessment on top of it. Then we have a fortnight to get everything in that box proven, sworn, and ready to stop them cold on the courthouse steps, Monroe said. It is not much time, Annie, but it is enough if we do not waste a single day of it. She reached across the dark space between their 2 horses and found his hand, and held it a moment, not as a woman overcome with fear, but as one sealing a bargain, and he held hers back with a steadiness that told her, more surely than any words could have, exactly where he meant to stand beside her when Saturday came. The tin box, opened by lamplight at Reverend Whitlock's kitchen table with Ezra Prude propped up to guide them through his own careful handwriting, proved to hold precisely what Prude had promised and more. There were pages copied in his own hand from Kettering's true ledger, showing dates and brand numbers and the small, damning notation beside each one, rebranded, and a column of names, homesteaders and small ranchers across 3 sections of Dry Fork County, whose herds had been quietly absorbed into Kettering's own tally over the past 2 years. There was, folded separately, a single sheet in a different hand entirely, one Annie recognized with a jolt as belonging to the county recorder Whitfield himself, listing survey corners moved and the dollar sum paid for each, and beside the entry for the Covington Homestead's original corner, a figure of $40 and the notation 11 rods east to west line, spring included. And beneath all of it, at the very bottom of the box, lay the true mortgage papers on the Covington homestead, the actual loan Daniel Covington had in fact once taken out years before, for seed grain rather than cattle stock, a debt of $30 paid in full within the year and marked satisfied in the bank's own hand. Entirely unrelated to the $600 cattle lien, the syndicate had later forged and filed against the property in Daniel's name. He never borrowed a dollar for cattle in his life, Annie said, her voice not quite steady as she traced the true, small, honest debt with one finger. He borrowed for seed corn the year the grasshoppers came, and he paid it back before the next harvest, exactly as he told me. I knew it. I always knew it. Monroe watched her a long moment and did not reach for her hand this time, only let her have that private grief and vindication together without intruding on either, and she was grateful to him for it in a way she did not yet have words to say aloud. "We will need more than this box," he said gently, when she had composed herself. "We will need proof willing to stand up in front of the judge and swear to it," and Whitfield's own hand compared side by side with the recorder's true files, and every small rancher whose brand was stolen willing to say so out loud instead of staying quiet out of fear. "Then we go and ask them," Annie said. "Every one of them, starting tomorrow." The fortnight that followed was the busiest of Annie Covington's life since the year she and Daniel had broken sod together, and she found, riding from homestead to homestead with Monroe Easton at her side, that fear made poor company beside determination, and that determination shared was a far lighter burden than determination carried alone. They rode first to old Tom Bellwether, who confirmed at once that 11 head bearing his own rocking bee mark had vanished from his tally 2 winters past and turned up. He was near certain, though he had never dared say so aloud, wearing a Kettering brand run right over the old iron scar. They rode to a Norwegian family named Halvorsen whose spring had gone dry the same season. A Kettering survey crew had passed through their section, and who had never understood, until Monroe laid it out plain with his own transit readings, that their water had not failed by nature's hand at all, but had been quietly redirected by a corner stake moved 60 feet in the night. They rode to 3 more families besides, each with their own small grievance, each one alone too frightened or too poor to fight the syndicate, and each one, once shown Prout's ledger pages and Monroe's careful surveys side by side, willing at last to add their voice to a chorus none of them would have dared to raise alone. Through it all, Annie watched Monroe work, patient and exact, laying out figures and bearings with the same careful hands he had once used to steal a family's water in Kansas. And she understood, more each day, that a man's past was not the whole measure of him, only the beginning of the story he chose to write over it afterward. It was on the last evening before the auction, the 2 of them sitting on the porch step of Annie's soddy with the tin box of evidence locked safe inside, and the dry hills gone violet with dusk, that Monroe finally asked her the question she had half expected and had not let herself hope for too openly. "When this is settled," he said, turning his hat slowly in his hands, "whichever way it falls, I find I do not want to go back to being merely the county surveyor who calls at your homestead on business, Annie. I have watched you fight 2 years for this land and never once break, and I have come, somewhere in these past weeks, to love you for it, and for a good deal more besides that has nothing to do with property lines at all." Annie was quiet a moment, watching the last light drain out of the sky above the rise where Daniel lay buried, and she found, searching her own heart with the same careful honesty she had demanded of Monroe from the start, that the answer was already there and had been for some time. "I loved my husband well, and I grieved him true," she said. "And I did not think, when I buried him on that rise, that I would ever again want to build a life alongside another man. But you have not once asked me to be smaller than I am, Monroe Easton, nor to hand you my judgment along with my heart, and that is a rarer thing than I think you know. I love you too. I have for some weeks now, if I am honest, though I made myself wait to say it until I was certain it was not merely gratitude wearing love's clothes. And now I am certain," Annie said, and when he leaned toward her in the falling dark she met him the rest of the way, and the kiss they shared on that porch step was slow and unhurried and entirely unlike the desperate stolen moment in the smoke of the grass fire. A kiss built not on fear for each other's safety, but on two people who had each demanded honesty of the other and had, at the end of it, found something worth building a whole life upon. Saturday came bright and merciless, the sky a hard, cloudless blue that had not delivered rain in 12 months, and by 9 in the morning the courthouse square in Willow Creek was crowded thicker than Annie had ever seen it. Ranchers and homesteaders and townsfolk gathered to watch the county sell off a widow's homestead for unpaid taxes, some out of simple curiosity, more than a few, Annie suspected. Because word had traveled that there might be more to this particular auction than the notice posted on the courthouse door had said. Judge Holloway had come up from Pueblo the evening before to preside, a lean, silver-haired man known through 3 counties for a dry wit and very little patience for nonsense, and he sat now at a small table set up on the courthouse steps with the county's tax rolls before him, while the auctioneer, a florid man named Dutton who did a brisk trade in cattle and land sales alike, cleared his throat and called the crowd to order. Silas Kettering himself stood near the front of the gathering in a black coat despite the heat, flanked by Whitfield the recorder and by Jessie Coyle, and Annie, standing at the back of the crowd with Monroe close beside her and the tin box held tight in her own 2 hands, felt her heart hammering so hard she was certain the whole square must hear it. "The property in question," Dutton announced, reading from Whitfield's notice, "being the homestead of the late Daniel Covington, now held by his widow Mrs. Annie Covington, assessed delinquent on taxes owing to an outstanding lien of $600 recorded against the property, said lien now called due in full by the holder, the Kettering Cattle and Land Company. The property being offered this day to satisfy that debt, opening bid to be received from the lien holder at the full sum owing." $600, Kettering said loudly, before Dutton had even finished lowering the paper, and a murmur ran through the crowd at the boldness of it, a man bidding the exact sum he claimed the widow owed him, plain as daylight what the outcome was meant to be. $600 is bid, Dutton called. "Do I hear further bidding? Going once." "I object to this sale," Annie said, stepping forward, her voice ringing out clear across the square, "on the grounds that the lien it is founded upon is a forgery, and I have proof of it in my hands this moment." A gasp ran through the crowd, and Kettering's face went dark with fury, and Sheriff Dobbs, standing near the judge's table, took a half-step forward as though uncertain whether his duty lay in silencing her or hearing her out. "Mrs. Covington," Judge Holloway said, holding up a hand to still both the crowd and the sheriff at once, "this is an auction, not a courtroom, but I have not yet struck my gavel, and I find myself curious what proof a homestead widow might be carrying in a tin box on auction day. Approach the table." Annie crossed the square with Monroe a half-step behind her, and laid the box upon the judge's table, and opened it herself before the whole assembled crowd, drawing out first the bank's own record marked satisfied showing Daniel Covington's true and modest seed-grain debt paid in full 2 years before his death, and then the forged cattle lien itself, and finally Whitfield's own ledger sheet in his own unmistakable hand, listing the $40 paid to move the Covington survey corner 11 rods to steal her spring. "That is a fabrication," Whitfield burst out, his face gone pale and slick with sudden sweat. "I have never seen that paper in my life." "Then you will have no objection," Judge Holloway said mildly, "to setting your hand to a fresh sheet this moment, so the clerk of this court may compare it against the writing here, since you claim never to have made it." Whitfield's silence was answer enough for half the crowd, but it was Ezra Prout who settled the matter beyond any further doubt, stepping forward from where Reverend Whitlock had helped him down from a wagon at the edge of the square, his ruined face grim but his voice, when he found it, carrying with surprising strength. "I kept those books myself 3 years for Silas Kettering," Prout said. "Every page in that box is copied faithful from his own true ledger, the one he keeps locked in his office safe, not the clean one the bank examiners see. He has been stealing brands off small ranchers' herds across this county for 2 years, and paying Whitfield to move survey stakes to steal their water besides. And when I tried to carry proof of it to a judge myself, his foreman Jesse Coyle beat me near to death on the Willow Creek Road and left me for dead in the grass, where this good woman and this good man found me and saved my life." The square had gone utterly silent, every eye fixed on Kettering, whose composure had finally cracked into something closer to open panic. And it was old Tom Bellwether's voice that broke the silence first, calling out from the crowd that 11 head of his own rocking bee cattle had vanished 2 winters past, and he would wager his last dollar they were standing this very day in Kettering's own herd, wearing a brand run hot over his own mark. And the Havorson family calling out after him about their stolen spring, and within a few short minutes the whole square had become a chorus of small grievances long swallowed in fear, now spoken plain and loud with nothing left to lose. Judge Holloway struck his gavel at last, though not to close the sale. "This auction is suspended," he said, "pending a full accounting of these ledgers and this recorder's files, which I will personally see conducted before any property in this county changes hands over a debt so plainly in dispute. Sheriff Dobbs, you will take Mr. Whitfield into custody on suspicion of forgery and fraud against the county, and you will see that Mr. Jesse Coyle is likewise held to answer for an assault that has gone unpunished a good deal too long already. As for you, Mr. Kettering, I would advise you to secure yourself a lawyer considerably more honest than your bookkeeping, for I intend to see every stolen head of cattle and every stolen rod of ground in this county returned to its rightful owner before I ride back to Pueblo, however long that takes." Kettering tried, for one wild moment, to bolt through the crowd, and it was Monroe Easton who caught his arm and held him fast until Sheriff Dobbs could reach them. And the crowd that had, only a fortnight before, murmured doubt about the surveyor's loyalties now parted around him with something closer to awe, and old Tom Bellwether's voice rose up loud and satisfied above the general clamor, telling anyone near enough to hear that he had said all along Monroe Easton was an honest man. And here was the whole county finally caught up to what he had known since the night of the fire. It took the better part of that fortnight for Judge Holloway's accounting to run its full course, and Willow Creek talked of little else the whole while. Whitfield, faced with his own handwriting compared side by side across a dozen falsified corners, confessed the whole scheme rather than risk a longer sentence, and named every survey he had altered and every dollar Kettering had paid him to do it. Jesse Coyle, held in the county jail on the assault charge, tried at first to lay the blame for Ezra Prout's beating on Kettering's direct order, and Kettering, in turn, tried to claim he had known nothing of Coyle's methods, though the true ledger in his own hand, found at last in the safe at his home ranch exactly as Prout had described it, made a liar of him on every page. In the end, Kettering lost his ranch, his cattle, and his liberty for the better part of 5 years to come, and the syndicate that had bled small ranchers dry across Dry Fork County for 2 years was broken apart at the seams, its stolen cattle returned brand by brand to their rightful owners through a long, careful process the judge himself oversaw, and every falsified survey corner ordered resurveyed true, at the county's expense, by the one surveyor in the territory whose honesty had, by then, been proven beyond any further doubt. Annie Covington's homestead was restored to her outright, the forged lien struck from the county's books forever. Her true corner marked 11 rods where it had always rightfully stood, spring and all. It was the county commissioners, gathering the following month to settle the last of the matter, who raised the question of reward. "There is a sum," the eldest commissioner explained, standing before the two of them in the same courthouse where the auction had so nearly gone forward, "set aside from the sale of Kettering's confiscated cattle, above and beyond what is owed back to the ranchers he stole from. The county would like to see a portion of it go to you both, Mrs. Covington, Mr. Easton, in recognition of what you uncovered and what it cost you to uncover it." Annie glanced at Monroe and found him already looking at her, and some understanding passed silently between them before either had spoken a word. "We will not take it for ourselves," Annie said. "Not because we do not need it, for heaven knows I have gone 2 years pinching every dollar my needle could earn, but because this county needs it worse than either of us do, and needs it in a form that will outlast us both." "What would you have it spent on instead?" the commissioner asked. "A proper irrigation ditch," Monroe said, "surveyed true and shared fair among every small holding along the Willow Creek bottom, so that no family in this county ever again has to watch a rich man's cattle drink while their own children's garden dies of thirst. And a fund at the recorder's office to pay for regular independent review of every survey filed in this county from this day forward, so that no clerk is ever again tempted by a syndicate's $40 to move a widow's boundary line in the dark." The commissioners argued a little, as commissioners will, over the particulars, but in the end the county set aside the whole reward exactly as Annie and Monroe had asked, and by the following spring, though the drought had not yet fully broken, a new ditch ran clear and shared along the Willow Creek bottom, and every small rancher who had once lived in fear of Kettering's altered brands now held, besides their returned cattle, a plainly recorded, honestly surveyed claim to the water that kept them alive. Annie Covington and Monroe Easton were married that same autumn, in the little church where Reverend Whitlock had once hidden a dying man's secret. On a cool, clear morning when the first real rain in over a year had fallen 2 nights before and left the whole dry county smelling, everyone agreed, like the sweetest thing on earth. Old Tom Bellwether gave Annie away in the absence of any living family of her own, and Ezra Prout, walking now with only the faintest hitch in his step and a scar that would never quite fade from his temple, stood as Monroe's witness and declared, to general laughter, that he had never in his life been so glad to have been left half dead in a widow's grass. Annie wore, for her second wedding, a gown of her own careful making, gray-blue wool she had chosen herself and cut with her own 2 capable hands, and when Monroe Easton took her hands in his before Reverend Whitlock and the whole gathered town of Willow Creek, he did not promise her, as some men might, that he would keep her safe from every hardship the dry country could still throw at them, for they both knew by then that no promise on earth could guarantee so much, and that safety was not, in truth, the thing she had ever asked of him. "I promise you my whole truth, every day of my life," he said instead, "and my whole heart alongside it, and the same steady hands you first watched work a transit over your boundary line, now given over entirely to building whatever this life asks of us together." "And I promise you," Annie said, her voice steady and sure in the way it had been steady and sure since the very first morning she knelt over a stranger in the grass and refused to let fear decide what she did next, "that I will never again make you carry any burden of yours alone in silence, so long as you keep offering me the truth of it the way you always have. I have fought 2 years for a line on a map, Monroe Easton, and I have learned this year that the line worth fighting hardest for was never drawn in dirt at all." They settled together on the homestead by the spring, Annie's shop in town thriving now under the steady custom of a county grateful for what she had helped uncover, Monroe riding out most days to survey the new irrigation lines, and more often as seasons passed, simply to be home by dusk to the woman and the water and the wide, dry country he had once nearly betrayed, and had, in the end, helped to make whole. The rains came back, slow and uncertain at first the way rains always do in that country, and the grass greened along the Willow Creek bottom, and the line between the Covington homestead and whatever remained of the broken Kettering range stood surveyed true and recorded honest in the county's books, exactly where it had always rightfully belonged, and exactly where, on the morning Annie Covington had first walked it alone with her husband's old compass in hand. She had never once imagined it would lead her to a love worth every hard mile of the fight.